São Paulo is one of the 26 states of the Federative Republic of Brazil and is named after Saint Paul of Tarsus, as the richest Brazilian state and a major industrial complex, often dubbed the locomotive of Brazil. The state alone is responsible for a third of Brazilian GDP. São Paulo also has the second highest Human Development Index and GDP per capita, the fourth lowest infant mortality rate and the third lowest rate of illiteracy among the federative units of Brazil. If it were an independent country, its nominal GDP would be ranked among the top 20 in the world. With more than 45 million inhabitants in 2014, São Paulo is the most populous Brazilian state, the most populous national subdivision in the Americas, and the third most populous political unit of South America, surpassed only by the rest of the Brazilian Federation and Colombia. The local population is one of the most diverse in the country and descended mostly from Italians, who began immigrating to the country in the late 19th century, of the Portuguese, who colonized Brazil and installed the first European settlements in the region, indigenous peoples, a large number of distinct ethnic groups, African peoples, who were brought from Africa in colonial era to be enslaved, and migrants from other regions of the country. Other major immigration flows, as Arabs, Germans, Spanish, Japanese and Chinese, also had a significant presence in the ethnic composition of the local population. The area that today corresponds to the state territory was already inhabited by indigenous peoples from approximately 12,000 BC. In the early 16th century, the coast of the region began to be visited by Portuguese and Spanish navigators. However, only in 1532 Martim Afonso de Sousa would establish the first Portuguese permanent settlement in the Americas, the village of São Vicente, in the Baixada Santista. In the 17th century, the Paulistas Bandeirantes intensified the exploration of the interior of the colony, which eventually expanded the territorial domain of the Portuguese Empire in South America. In the 18th century, after the establishment of the province of São Paulo, the region begins to gain political weight. After independence, during the Empire of Brazil, São Paulo begins to become a major agricultural producer, which ultimately create a rich regional rural oligarchy, which would switch on the command of the Brazilian government with the Minas Gerais elites during the early Republican period. Under the Vargas era, the state was one of the first to initiate a process of industrialization, and its population becomes one of the most urban of the federation. The city of São Paulo, the homonymous state capital, is ranked as the 12th largest city on the planet, and its metropolitan area, with 20 million inhabitants, is the 9th largest in the world and second in the Americas, after Greater Mexico City. Regions near the city of São Paulo are also metropolitan areas, such as Campinas, Santos, Sorocaba and São José dos Campos. The total population of these areas, coupled with the capital, the so-called expanded metropolitan complex, exceeds 30 million inhabitants, i.e. approximately 75% of the population of São Paulo statewide, the first micrometropolis in the southern hemisphere, joining 65 municipalities that together are home to 12% of the Brazilian population. History. Early period. In pre-European times, the area that is now São Paulo state was occupied by the Tupi Peoples nation, who subsisted through hunting and cultivation. The first European to settle in the area was João Ramalho, a Portuguese sailor who may have been shipwrecked around 1510, 10 years after the first Portuguese landfall in Brazil. He married the daughter of a local chieftain and became a settler. In 1532, the first colonial expedition, led by Martim Afonso de Sousa of Portugal, landed at São Vicente. De Sousa added Ramalho's settlement to his colony. Early European colonization of Brazil was very limited. Portugal was more interested in Africa and Asia. But with English and French privateerships just off the coast, the territory had to be protected. Unwilling to shoulder the burden of defense himself, the Portuguese ruler, King João III of Portugal, divided the coast into captaincies, or swathes of land, 50 leagues apart. He distributed them among well-connected Portuguese, hoping that each would be self-reliant. The early port and sugar-cultivating settlement of São Vicente was one rare success connected to this policy. In 1548, João III brought Brazil under direct royal control. Fearing Indian attack, he discouraged development of the territory's vast interior. Some whites headed nonetheless for Piratininga, a plateau near São Vicente, drawn by its navigable rivers and agricultural potential. Bordered a Campo, the plateau settlement became an official town in 1553. The history of São Paulo city proper begins with the founding of a Jesuit mission on January 25, 1554, the anniversary of Saint Paul's conversion. The station, which is at the heart of the current city, was named São Paulo dos Campos de Piratininga. In 1560, the threat of Indian attack led many to flee from the exposed Santo André da Borda de Campo to the walled Collegio. 2 years later, the Collegio was besieged. Though the town survived, fighting took place sporadically for another 3 decades. By 1600, the town had about 1,500 citizens and 150 households. Little was produced for export, save a number of agricultural goods. The isolation was to continue for many years, as the development of Brazil centered on the sugar plantations in the northeast. The city's location, at the mouth of the Tietê-Paranapanema river system, made it an ideal base for another activity, enslaving expeditions. The economics were simple. Enslaved manpower for Brazil's northern sugar plantations were in short supply. Enslaved Africans were expensive, so demand for indigenous captives soared. The task was, nonetheless, hard, if not impossible, to achieve. Expansion among those who attempted to enslave the native were explorers of the hinterland called bandeirantes. For the base in São Paulo, they also combed the interior in search of natural riches. Silver, gold and diamonds were companion pursuits, as well as the exploration of unknown territories. Roman Catholic missionaries sometimes tagged along, as efforts at converting the native worked hand in hand with Portuguese colonialism. Despite their atrocities, the bandeirantes are now equally remembered for penetrating Brazil's vast interior. Trading posts established by them became permanent settlements. Interior routes opened up. Though the bandeirantes had no loyalty to the Portuguese crown, they did claim land for the king. Thus, the borders of Brazil were pushed forward to the Amazon region and the Andes Mountains. Napoleon's invasion of Portugal in 1807 prompted the British Royal Navy to evacuate King João VI of Portugal, Portugal's Prince Regent, for the capital Lisbon, to Rio de Janeiro, and Brazil became the temporary headquarters of the Portuguese Empire. João VI rewarded his hosts with economic reforms that would prove crucial to São Paulo's rise. Brazil's ports, long closed to non-Portuguese ships, were opened up to international trade. Restrictions on manufacturing were waived. When Napoleon was defeated in 1815, João gave political shape to his territory, which became the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil and the Algarves. Portugal and Brazil, in other words, were ostensibly co-equals. Returning to Portugal 6 years later, João left his son, Pedro, to rule as regent and governor. Empire of Brazil period. Pedro inherited his father's love of Brazil. resisting demands from Lisbon that Brazil should be ruled from Europe once again. Legend has it that in 1822 the regent was riding outside São Paulo when a messenger delivered a missive demanding his return to Europe, and Dom Pedro waved his sword and shouted, "Independencia ao morte." João had whetted the appetite of Brazilians, who now sought a full break from the monarchy. The ever-restless Paulistas were at the vanguard of the independence movement. The small mother country of Portugal was in no position to resist. On September 7, 1822, Dom Pedro rubber-stamped Brazil's independence. He was crowned emperor shortly afterwards. The emperors ruled an independent Brazil until 1889. Over this time, the growth of liberalism in Europe had a parallel in Brazil. As the Brazilian provinces became more assertive, São Paulo was the scene of a minor liberal revolution in 1842. When independence was declared, the city of São Paulo had just 25,000 people and 4,000 houses, but the next 60 years would see gradual growth. In 1828, the law school, the pioneer of the city's intellectual tradition, opened. The first newspaper, O Farol Paulistano, appeared in 1827. Municipal developments such as botanical gardens, an opera house and a library, gave the city a cultural boost. Regardless, São Paulo still faced many hurdles, especially transport. Mule trains were the main method of transportation, and the road from the plateau down to the port of Santos was famously arduous. In the late 1860s, São Paulo got its first railway line, developed by British engineers, to the port of Santos. Other lines, such as a railway to Campinas, were soon built. This was good timing, because in the 1880s the coffee craze hit in earnest. Brazil, which had been growing it since the mid-18th century, could grow more. The Paraíba Valley, which spans the states of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, had suitable soil and climate. São Paulo City, at the western end of the Paraíba Valley, was well positioned to channel the coffee to the port of Santos. Republican era. Meanwhile, the Brazilian monarchy had fallen in 1889. A feudalistic regime. The new republic had friends only among the sugar planters of the northeast, whose dominance Paulistanos, among others, despised. In 1891, a new federal constitution, which delegated power to the states, was approved. The new coffee elite saw its chance. São Paulo ironed out a power-sharing understanding, known as the Café com Leite deal, with dairy-rich Minas Gerais, Brazil's other dominant state. Together, they held a virtual lock-on federal power. Brazilian politics now became a favorite pastime of the once rebellious Paulistanos, who sent several presidents to Rio de Janeiro, including Prudente Moraes, Brazil's first civilian president, who took office in 1894. Plantation labor was needed, this time for coffee, not sugar. Slavery had been fading since the import of enslaved Africans was outlawed in 1850. São Paulo, thanks to such figures as Luiz Gama, was a center of abolitionism. In 1888, Brazil abolished slavery, and the freed African Brazilians who had been helping build the nation were then forced to beg for their jobs back, working for food and shelter only because of the failure of the system to integrate them as equal citizens with Euro-Brazilians. In an effort to bleach the race, as the nation's leaders feared Brazil was becoming a black country, Spanish, Portuguese and Italian nationals were given incentives to become farm workers in São Paulo. The state government was so eager to bring in European immigrants that it paid for the trips and provided varying levels of subsidy. By 1893, foreigners made up over 55% of São Paulo's population. Fearing oversupply, the government applied the brakes briefly in 1899, then the boom resumed. From 1908, the Japanese arrived in great numbers, many destined for the plantations on fixed-term contracts. By 1920, São Paulo was Brazil's second-largest city. A half-century before, it had been just the 10th largest. Immigration and migration of Paulistas from other towns as well as Nordestinos and citizens from other states, the coffee industry, and modernization through the manufacturing of textiles, car and airplane parts, as well as food and technological industries, construction, fashion and services transformed the greater São Paulo area into a thriving megalopolis and one of the world's greatest multi-ethnic regions. Early 20th century. Between 1901 and 1910, coffee made up 51% of Brazil's total exports, far overshadowing rubber, sugar and cotton. But reliance on coffee made Brazil vulnerable to poor harvests and the whims of world markets. The development of plantations in the 1890s, and widespread reliance on credit, took place against fluctuating prices and supply levels, culminating in saturation of the international market around the start of the 20th century. The government's policies of valorizing, borrowing money to buy coffee and stockpiling it, in order to have a surplus during bad harvests, and meanwhile taxing coffee exports to pay off loans, seemed feasible in the short term. But in the longer term, these actions contributed to oversupply and eventual collapse. São Paulo's industrial development, from 1889 into the 1940s, was gradual and inward-looking. Initially, industry was closely associated with agriculture. Cotton plantations led to the growth of textile manufacturing. Coffee planters were among the early industrial investors. The boom in immigration provided a market for goods, and sectors such as food processing grew. Traditional immigrant families such as the Matarazzo, Dianas, Mo Farah and Maluf became industrialists, entrepreneurs, and leading politicians. Restrictions on imports forced by World Wars and government policies of import substitution and trade tariffs all contributed to industrial growth. By 1945, São Paulo had become the largest industrial center in South America. World War I sent ripples through Brazil. Inflation was rampant. Some 50,000 workers went on strike. The growing of the urban population grew increasingly resentful of the coffee elite. Disaffected intellectuals expressed the views during a memorable week of modern art in 1922. 2 years later, a garrison of soldiers staged a revolt. The standoff was also political. Politics had been long monopolized by the Paulista Republican Party, but in 1926 a more left-leaning party rose in opposition. In 1928, the PRP amended São Paulo's state constitution to give it more control over the city. The turbulence was mirrored on Brazil's national scene. With the Great Depression, coffee prices plunged, as did real GDP. Americans, keen investors during the 1920s, backed away. The opening of the first highway between São Paulo and Rio in 1928 was one of the few bright spots. Into the breach stepped Getúlio Vargas, a Southerner veteran in state politics. In Brazil's 1930 presidential elections, he opposed Julio Prestes, a favorite son of São Paulo. Vargas lost the election, but with backing from Minas Gerais state, São Paulo's ever-jealous former ally and neighbor to the north, he seized power regardless. Paulista War. The Constitutionalist Revolution of 1932. Paulista War is the name given to the uprising of the population of the Brazilian state of São Paulo against the federal government of Vargas. Its main goal was to press the provisional government headed by Getúlio Vargas to enact a new constitution, since it had revoked the previous one, adopted in 1889. However, as the movement developed and resentment against President Vargas grew deeper, it came to advocate the overthrow of the federal government and the secession of São Paulo from the Brazilian Federation. But it is noted that the separatist scenario was used as guerrilla tactics by the federal government to turn the population of the rest of the country against the state of São Paulo, broadcasting the alleged separatist notion throughout the country. There is no evidence that the movement's commanders sought separatism. The uprising started on July 9, 1932, after 5 protesting students were killed by government troops on May 23, 1932. On the wake of their deaths, a movement called MMDC started. A 5th victim, Alvarenga, was also shot that night, but died months later. Revolutionary troops entrenched in the battlefield. In a few months, the state of São Paulo rebelled against the federal government, counting on the solidarity of 3 other powerful states. The politicians of São Paulo expected a quick war. However, that solidarity was never translated into actual support, and the São Paulo Civil War was won by the Federation on October 2, 1932. In spite of its military defeat, some of the movement's main demands were finally granted by Vargas afterwards: the appointment of a non-military state governor, the election of a constituent assembly, and, finally, the enactment of a new constitution in 1934. However, that constitution was short-lived, as in 1937, amidst growing extremism on the left and right wings of the political spectrum. Vargas closed the National Congress and enacted another constitution, which established an authoritarian regime called Estado Novo. Late 20th century Vargas's rule was a study in political turbulence. Elected in 1934, he ruled by dictatorship from 1937 to 1945, a period dubbed the Estado Novo. Thrown out by a coup in 1945, he ran for office again in 1950, and was overwhelmingly elected. On the verge of being overthrown from office again, he committed suicide in 1954. Vargas's main legacy was the centralization of power, the encouragement of industry and diversification of agriculture, not to mention the abolition of subsidies on coffee. Finally did away with the dominance of the coffee oligarchies. His replacement, Juscelino Kubitschek, focused on heavy industry. Kubitschek built car factories, steel plants, hydropower infrastructure and roads. Petrobras, Brazil's oil monolith, was set up in 1953. By 1958, São Paulo state controlled some 55% of Brazil's industrial production, up from 17% in 1907. Another of Kubitschek's pet projects was the creation of Brasília, which became Brazil's capital in 1960, the year Kubitschek stepped down. The University of São Paulo was founded in 1934, 2 years after São Paulo's failed uprising. It has established itself as the most prestigious higher learning institution in the country, with a transitional government from military to civil and a new currency that made stagnant the economy during the mid to late 1980s. Unemployment and crime became rampant. São Paulo, by now the world's 3rd largest city after Mexico City and Tokyo, was hard hit. Wealthy Brazilians retreated to suburban highly secured housing complexes such as Alphaville and favelas. Pockets of substandard living slums that lined the periphery had a tremendous growth. For the first time in history, Brazil experienced large segments of its population immigrating to continents such as North America, Europe, Australia, and East Asia, particularly to Japan. Geography. São Paulo is one of 27 states of Brazil, located southwest of the southeast region. The state area is 248,222.362 square kilometers, most of the north of the Tropic of Capricorn, and the 12th unit of the Brazilian Federation in area and the second in the southeast region, behind only Minas Gerais. The state has a relatively high relief, having 85% of its surface between 300 and 900 meters above sea level, 8% below 300 meters and 7% over 900 meters. The distance between its north and south endpoints is 611 kilometers and 923 kilometers between the east-west extremes. The state time zone follows the Brazilian time, which is 3 hours late in relation to the Greenwich meridian. It is limited to the states of Minas Gerais to the north and northeast, the Paraná to the south, and Rio de Janeiro north and Mato Grosso do Sul to the west, and the Atlantic Ocean to the southeast. The coastline consists of plains below 300 meters that border the Serra do Mar, located in the Serra da Mantiqueira Mindstone, with 2,798 meters above sea level, is the highest point the state territory and the fifth in the country. São Paulo has its territory divided into 21 watersheds, inserted in 3 river basin districts, the largest of which is the Paraná, which covers much of the state territory. Noteworthy is the Rio Grande, which born in Minas Gerais and join with Paranaíba to form the Paraná River, which separates São Paulo from Mato Grosso do Sul. 2 major rivers Paulistas tributaries of the left bank of the Paraná River of the Paranapanema, are 930 kilometers long and a natural divider between São Paulo and Paraná in most of its course, and the Tietê River, which has a length of 1,136 kilometers and runs through the state territory from southeast to northwest, from its source in Salesópolis to its mouth in the city of Itapura. Climate: the state territory covers 7 distinct climatic types, taking into account the temperature and rainfall. In the mountain areas of the state, there is subtropical climate. In areas of high altitude such as the Serra do Mar e Serra da Mantiqueira, having humid, hot summers and average temperatures below 18 degrees Celsius in the month, cooler year, and oceanic with regular and well distributed throughout the year and warmer summers. Rains. On the coast, the climate is superhumid tropical type, very similar to the prevailing equatorial climate in the Amazon, with rainfall exceeding 60 monthly millimeters in every month of the year, without the existence of a dry season. The tropical climate of altitude, predominant in the state territory, specifically in the center of the state, is characterized by a summer rainy season and a dry season in winter, with temperatures above 22 degrees Celsius in the hottest month of the year. In other areas, there is tropical savanna climate with rainfall less than 60 millimeters in 1 or more months of the year and warmer, with average temperatures above 18 degrees Celsius during the year. There are also small areas with characteristics of monsoons. The occurrence of snow is very rare, but has been recorded in Campos de Jordão, and there are also reports that the phenomenon has occurred in several parts of the south of the state, except for the Ribeira Valley. The frosts are common, especially in higher areas with altitude of 800 meters.